You're listening to Olivia's Book Club, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Olivia's Book Club, and I'm your host, Olivia Fierro, ready to geek out at even a higher level than usual because I am joined by a guest in real life, not even by Zoom, so actual human. I could reach over and touch you. I won't, just because I don't want to be creepy, Barbara. But Barbara VanDenburgh is joining us. She is the book's editor and writer with USA Today and has made a life and career out of your love of books. You are the host and moderator for the First Draft Book Club at Changing Hands in Phoenix. If you're listening to this from outside of the Arizona area, make sure you visit Changing Hands if you ever visit the Valley of the Sun. It is a must because you can have beer and wine and books all in one place. So Barbara, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I love when I can meet anybody who finds a passion in their life and they're able to make a career out of it. Because, you know, I mean, working can be a drag, but it's a lot less of a drag if it's something that you love to do. So tell me about just when you first fell in love with books and how you figured out, hey, I can do this for a living.
Well, I've always been in love with, I was an only child and a nerd, and so books were my friends because I didn't have anybody to play with. So I don't know if that's like a charming answer or a sad answer.
Totally charming.
No, I read a lot when I was a kid. My mother would take me to the library most days and pick out stacks of books, and it was what I did to entertain myself. One of the things I did to entertain myself as an only child with two working parents. And by the time I hit middle school, high school, I realized reading and writing was what I was best at school. It was what I liked doing the best. I liked the feeling of being good at this thing. And yeah, I knew pretty early on that I wanted to do something with reading and writing.
I can relate so much because there was a really terrible, traumatic Christmas for me where my family very generously gave me both a bicycle and roller skates. And all I could feel was this sense of dread, like, oh my God, do they expect me to be outside? This is awful. And I did not have any interest in being outside because I would rather be at home, inside, quietly reading, playing with myself, with dolls or whatever, maybe watching a little TV and then going back to the books. I didn't need all of that activity.
I would go outside to climb the tree. We had a tree in the front yard. I would climb the tree and sit up at the top of the tree with a book.
To
and
read
so that
there.
nobody could find me.
Oh, that's ideal. Oh, dreamy. So you rewind a little bit. ASU graduate, started writing for the Arizona Republic.
Yes, I got very lucky. I think it's harder to do this now, but I just sort of lucked my way. I'd never worked in newspapers. I didn't do anything with journalism in college. I wanted to read and I wanted to write, and that's all I knew how to do. And I got very lucky. I got a job as a newsroom assistant at the Arizona Republic. And I was just sort of annoying to everybody about the things I was interested in until they started giving me assignments.
I love that. And I think the clearer people are about what they're into, the more that opportunity can come your way, right? I mean, it just makes sense.
Well, and the only reason I'm the books editor at USA Today and the only reason that I have my book club at Changing Hands is because I was annoying on Twitter. I mean, the short of it is that when Changing Hands in Phoenix opened, we did this for people not in the Phoenix area. We had this great independent local bookstore that had a location, some miles away, hard to get to from Central Phoenix. And they opened a Central Phoenix location, this secondary location with a bar inside of it, which is just wine and beer and books. Like, what more can you want? And you can go around the bookstore with a glass of wine and peruse the books and pick out what you want. And it's just dreamy. And I was obsessed with it. And I kept going to the bookstore every day and tweeting from the bookstore, here's what I'm reading, here's the book I'm buying, gosh, I'm so glad we have a bookstore now. And the bookstore reached out to me and was like, hey, how would you feel about moderating a book club? And it all took off from there. So be annoying about the things that you love and are passionate about, because you never know what doors of opportunity that might open.
That Barbara is going to be here anyway, so we might as well put her to work, right? I mean, I don't think she's going anywhere.
Oh gosh, that is what it was, isn't it?
Hey, that works too. It doesn't matter. However you get there is the perfect path. So I wanted to check in with you as we're early on in this new year and see which books. I mean, you read hundreds of books a year, or at least start hundreds of books a year,
I
right?
start more books than I finish, but yeah, I read a lot. I mean, I have to start a lot of books to try to figure out what it is I think people are going to be reading, what it is that I like, and so it's really, I don't know about you, but it's really hard for me to abandon a book.
Yes.
And I've had to get kind of mercenary about that.
Really?
And if a book doesn't have me by like the 50-page mark, I got to say goodbye.
Oh, brutal.
It's hard.
Wow.
I'm not wired that way.
So, and because the goal is, I mean, you only have so many opportunities to write about so many books, and you only really, I assume, want to write about books that you are recommending.
Yeah. I mean, I want to write about my personal book philosophy is that I want to spread the good stuff.
Yes.
And I want to champion new writers who are just coming in, who are debut authors especially, I'm really passionate about. And I want to spread the love. I'm not so much interested in tearing things down or, you know, there is a place for, and I do appreciate nuanced, rich books, criticism, but for me, my personal philosophy, where I'm at USA Today and how I want to use my time, I want to champion the good stuff.
Yeah, and remind people, I mean, the joy that can come from reading, because I'm always floored at how many people I'm very, very close with who will say, oh, gosh, I never read. And you just forget how wonderful an escape it can be, and you know that you don't need anybody talking to you and all the quiet that can come from it, and especially during the last couple of years in the pandemic when people were stuck.
Right.
I mean, it was just such a lifeline.
You know what I did during the pandemic that I never thought I would do is I read War and Peace.
You did? Wow.
And it was like in the early phase of the pandemic. It was in 2020 when we were all sort of like uncertain what was happening and mostly staying at home. And I read War and Peace, which was very difficult. I'm glad I did it. I'll probably never do it again. But it was something that centered me every day. I was like, I get to be quiet and just be with this book for like an hour, and it made me a better person. And I think reading does make you a better person.
You won't be selecting it for the book club anytime soon.
No.
Though. That'd be a little tough.
That would be a little much.
Okay, so what should we have on our radar early in this year if we're making these tough choices? Because we've only got so much time for so many books.
Well, okay, I'm going to hype 2 books first of all
Okay.
that have recently come out that I'm using for various book clubs. But I'm really obsessed with a book that just came out by a debut author. Her name is Tracey Rose Peyton, and the book is called Night Wherever We Go. It is historical fiction set in 1900s Texas during slavery, and it's by a Black debut author, and the book is about 6 Black slave women who live on this plantation in Texas before the Civil War. And you know, it's heavy. Obviously, it's about slavery, so it's not a light book, but it is strangely empowering and hopeful, because the way that she's written this book, it's about these women finding ways to stage little acts of rebellion and subvert the will of the slave owners and come into their own power in the ways that they can under this institution of slavery. So it's a really powerful book. She's such a good writer. It's so beautifully written. It's the kind of book where you want to like underline sentences.
Oh, I love that. And February Black History Month, so it really is time to
Perfect.
gravitate towards making sure we're having a rich list of diverse authors.
Perfect for Black History Month, and we will be that's a book that we'll be discussing at Changing Hands at 7 p.m. on Wednesday, February 22nd, if you're in town and want to come talk about it. But even if you're not in Phoenix, a must-read Black History Month book.
Fantastic. Thank you for the recommendation. What else have you recently read that you'd recommend?
So another book. I'm going to hype another book club.
Yes.
This is we have a book club at USA Today as well. And so we've started doing this, I think it's going to be on YouTube from now on, but we try to get the authors on or special guests to come on and talk to us about a recently released book. And so what we're doing for February, we're going to meet February 28th. It's going to be on YouTube. So if you can't watch it live, it'll live on YouTube. Well, we're speaking to author John Hendrickson about his memoir, Life on Delay, Making Peace with a Stutter. And so he's a great writer. He's a senior editor at The Atlantic. And he had this viral article he wrote about his stutter in 2020, and he interviewed Joe Biden.
Oh,
so
yes.
Then presidential candidate Joe Biden, who famously has a stutter and has lived with a stutter all of his life. John Hendrickson has also lived with a stutter all of his life. And so working off of that article, he writes this memoir that, you know, I don't have a stutter. I've never known anybody in my personal life who has had a stutter. So it seems like it would be too specific for you to be able to like relate to necessarily if that's not part of your life experience. But it's just such a good personal story. He's writing about his lifelong experience living with a stutter, trying to mask the stutter, going through speech therapy that didn't work, the substance abuse that he engaged in trying to mask it. And in doing so, he sort of deconstructs the stigma of the stutter and really is able to convey what life is like living with it. And it's just so eye-opening and beautifully written.
Wow.
And so really recommend that one.
And I think that those are, if somebody is a great writer, you're sharing that human experience, right? And it's overcoming whatever it is that makes us feel different or less than.
Yeah, it's yeah, you're right. And it's instead of it being a division or you feeling like, well, this person has such a different experience than me, I can't possibly relate. He's finding the commonalities in human experience, and we're all connected.
Oh, that sounds amazing. So you generally are reading books well ahead of their release?
Yeah, often, yeah.
Yes, okay.
Or desperately playing catch up. One of the two.
So those are two books that are already out that we can grab right now. We can jump in on these book clubs, and it's always just so fulfilling, I think, especially if you're really find something to be a good story, you get into it, you want to talk about it with somebody. I mean, that's what's amazing about a book club is there's a connective tissue. When two strangers otherwise have read the same book, you've automatically got something to talk about.
You've got kinship.
Yeah. You've had a very important shared experience. So, okay, looking ahead now, what other books are on your radar that are worth our time as we get into this new year?
Absolutely. So I'm just started reading, very into Victory City by Salman Rushdie.
Oh, yeah. I've been hearing a lot about this.
That comes out on Tuesday. Now, he Booker Prize winning author, beautiful with prose, just a great writer. And you might remember that in August, he survived a knife attack. He was giving a public lecture, and a man jumped out of the audience and really viciously attacked him. He lost sight in one of his eyes. He may have lost the eye. I'm not entirely sure. He had nerves severed in one of his arms, like really viciously attacked. He had been targeted by Muslim extremists for his writing, and so he had this fatwa on his head for decades, and somebody, attacked him.
Wow.
But he survived. I'm told that he's healing. His recovery is continuing, and so this is his first novel, his first book that's coming out since that attack, and it is this lavish fairy tale. It's fiction. It's a lavish fairy tale, really beautifully written, and so I just think he's an important person to be reading right now.
Wow. And a fairy tale, no less. A lot of people coming off of reading Fairy Tale by Stephen King.
Yes.
I thought it was amazing. It's very, very long.
I loved it.
But I loved it.
I grew up like the first, I think this is true for a lot of people, especially of my kind of like generation. The first adult author I started reading was Stephen King. He was so important when I was like between the ages of 12, which is too young. Between the ages of like 12 and 16, I like inhaled every Stephen King book, and I had sort of put him by the wayside and hadn't read him in a long time. And so Fairy Tale sort of brought me back into the fold and made me feel kind of the way I did again when I was 13, 14 years old.
I think anybody can truly create another world. Is actually creating another world and taking you there and making it feel, it makes you feel childlike and full of fascination and wonder. It was amazing. Okay, so we've got the Salman Rushdie.
Okay, if you want to be a even more serious than that, we have the climate book, The Facts and the Solutions by Greta Thunberg. Oh. So, of course, she's world famous climate activist. She's only 20. She's Swedish. She's only 20 years old. She's written this book. She has spoken to top climate change activists and meteorologists and engineers and oceanographers and historians, just experts across many, many fields to get at the heart at what the challenge is with climate change and how we can still do something to impact it. So I just find her an incredibly inspirational, powerful figure. And I like that. One of the things I like about her is, like, when you think about climate change and the effects of climate change, it can be incredibly overwhelming and despairing. And what I find so remarkable about her is that she has action steps, that she's not hopeless, that she's trying to tackle it practically and pragmatically. And I think that is just so hard to do. And so I just think she's such an incredible person.
Well, and I think that is the generation that's obviously going to lead the way to making any sort of lasting impact, and knowing that maybe in our lifetimes we're not going to fix all of this, but that doesn't mean we don't try.
Yeah, which I think is, it's hard for me. You know, I'm older than Greta. I'm not going to say how much older, but I'm older. I'm not
We're
Gen
all
Z.
older than her.
I'm barely a millennial. I'm hanging on to that. But yeah, it's hard not to feel totally overwhelmed by the scope of it and throw up your hands and say, well, nothing we can do. Yeah. But she insists that there is something we can do and is outlining steps for those things. And she's just, I want to listen to her when she talks.
Barbara's reading list is going to make us a lot smarter and maybe better human beings. Do you read any trash? No books are trash, of course.
No
kids.
books are trash. There are no guilty pleasures.
Right.
There's no trash. What you love to read is what you love to read.
Yes.
You know what I read that's probably trash to you? Well, I read a lot of horror.
You do?
I do. Outside of Stephen King, there's... Okay, so a horror book that, again, just came out.
Yes.
It's called How to Sell a Haunted House.
Oh, I want to read this.
By Grady Hendrix.
Yes.
Now, I'm imagining a lot of people listening to this are not horror novel fans necessarily, but I think Grady Hendrix is one of those writers for people who don't think they like horror novels. He wrote this incredible book some years ago called My Best Friend's Exorcism. I cannot recommend that book enough. It's set in a high school in the 1980s, and it's about these two girl best friends, and one of the girls becomes possessed. But it's all
not too far off from our memories of high school,
but,
right?
I mean, that's the thing. It's all a metaphor for adolescence and girl friendships at that time and at that phase of life. So he's really good about using horror as a metaphor for other things that you can relate to. So even if you're like squeamish and like, oh, I don't like horror, that's too much, that's weird, he's able to like relate it in a way. And so he's written a haunted house novel called How to Sell a Haunted House. And I think he's just such a good writer.
And I'm really terrible with the whole like official genres, because I mean, so many things kind of, I think, fall in between. And you're like, okay, what's the difference between what we would think of as like a thriller versus horror? And that can be just that it can be a little bit, there could be a supernatural element or some,
Mostly it's marketing. I mean, well, it's true. Like there are a lot of romances that you find in the literature section because somebody somewhere has decided that it's more important or more literary or artistic than something that's in the romance section. But that's not always the case. It's a lot of marketing. But there's no, I agree with you. There's no trash. You like what you like to read, and there's value in all of it. And I do not judge people ever for their reading preferences.
You have another recommendation?
Well, okay. Well, I'm going to make a confession.
Okay.
That we're talking about like preferences in reading and trash and whatever. I'm going to make a confession that I'm like the one woman left on the planet Earth who has not read a Colleen Hoover book.
You have not read one single Colleen. You really are so you got to hold on to this, because this is a very unique space.
Well, it is, but I don't think there's any like value in that necessarily. I don't think I'm a good person because I haven't read a Colleen Hoover book. It's just a fact. But she's got a new one coming out at the end of February 28th, that she's co-written with somebody, and I'm a little interested in this. She's got a book coming out called Never Never, and she has teamed up with Tarryn Fisher. I don't know if you've ever read Tarryn Fisher before, but she writes a lot of romance and a lot of romantic thrillers. And so she wrote a book called The Wives that was really good, and a book called The Wrong Family. And so she's teamed up with Tarryn Fisher for this like romantic thriller about these two people who have been in love since they were teenagers. And that all goes wrong somehow. So I haven't read this book yet, again, because I've not read any Colleen Hoover books, but I am curious to see how like her co-writing with somebody like, because she's just like, if you look at the bestseller numbers
it's
from
insane.
the past year, she's like, if you look at like the top 20, she's at least 10 of them.
Yes, it's crazy. I often think it must be so demoralizing for authors who, have just had a book come out, you do all of this work, or you're having your, dream come true of us on, with big publicity house, whatever, publishing house, and then you're like, but Colleen Hoover's taking up 6 of the top 20 spots.
Good for her.
So I have a harder time cracking in. It's incredible. I mean,
but good for her.
Yes.
That's the dream, right?
Yeah.
Like, she's just a person who liked to write. Like, she wasn't. I don't think she was somebody who ever went to like writing school or had any fancy degrees or anything like that. She was just a person who liked to write, and like, that's the dream. Good for her.
Yeah.
So have you read a lot of her books?
I have, not as many as everybody else, but I have read It Ends With Us, and It Starts With Us, and Verity, and Reminders of Him.
Okay, so for a neophyte like me who
Yes.
is somehow avoided, what
Yes.
is the starting point?
Ooh, I think It Ends With Us, because that's the one that was the TikTok videos of everybody sobbing their eyes out. And that's the one that's now been announced that Blake Lively is going to star in the feature film. And so I think it was that book in particular that made people, particularly during the pandemic, go back and dig deep through her library. And so various friends of mine passionately have, this one is my favorite book, or this one is my favorite book. So people, have real emotional connections to her writing. And, she was a social worker. She also says that, the kind of abusive nature of the relationship from It Ends With Us was inspired by her mother, who got them out of a situation and when she was a child. And so there's just a lot of reality and a lot of, she just is able to kind of get the emotional connection to the reader immediately.
Like a lot of everyday relatable human trauma kind of stuff.
Exactly. And then, Verity was obviously a departure for her because that was more of the psychological thriller. So this will be kind of a little more on that path. And I got to think it's partly to shine her gigantic spotlight on another talented author to do the co-writing thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm interested in that. I need to get on. I need to get on this train. I don't know why I've avoided it for so long, but I need to stop avoiding it. Okay, so another book that I'm in the middle of reading right now and I'm obsessed with, and this is a nonfiction book, and so I'm a movie geek. I love movies. In addition to books, I love movies. And I'm one of those weird people who really loves award shows. So I get really excited for the Oscars every year. So there's this book by Michael Schulman, who is a staff writer at The New Yorker. And he's written this book called Oscar Wars, A History of Hollywood in Gold, Sweat, and Tears. Oh. And it is all about the history of the Oscars and how people came to win the Oscars they won and the campaigning they did and sort of the behind the scenes infighting. And it's just juicy. And if you're somebody who likes Hollywood and Hollywood gossip and wants a peek behind the curtain, because you think of, I think most people think of the Oscars as being sort of an award of merit, right? Like, you've done this really good job creating this work of art or starring in this movie. Here's your reward for doing something really special. And there's like a lot of behind the scenes politicking going on and jockeying for position. And it's just really juicy and dirty. And I love that.
It's got to be filthy. Well, and then it's well timed with a story that was just recently in the news about an actress who received a nomination. I feel so, I haven't seen this movie. I don't know who this woman is, but I feel absolutely terrible for her that all of a sudden there's all these headlines like, will the Academy revoke her nomination?
Well, they're not going to revoke the nomination. So Andrea Riseborough, who is not a huge name, but she started she and her PR marketing rep did this sort of underground campaign to get her a nomination where they were really lobbying hard at people in the Academy to nominate her. And it was just this guerrilla campaign that they launched. And so they just sort of like beat the Academy at its own game in terms of lobbying and marketing for her to get nominated, and won. And like, good for her. Like, why not?
Right.
And so the Academy is now going to change its rules so that can't happen again, which it's just... I don't know. I don't think she did anything wrong. It was just amazing that she was able to pull it off.
Right. And of course, I'm sure by reading the book, you realize these campaigns are happening in a variety of ways, all the time.
A lot of glad handing behind the scenes from the very start.
From the very start. I mean, when they do the movie junkets and it's like, oh, you get to go to the south of France to screen this movie. Well, that's going to be, mean, just all of it from the beginning. So, okay, so that's really interesting.
It is really interesting. And so, like, the Oscars are March 12th. This comes out February 21st. So that gives you enough time to sort of, like, get a behind-the-scenes peek so you know what
I know what's going on
is.
here.
You know
I'm like an insider now, basically.
It's true. So, okay, something a little more lighthearted that I'm also really excited for is a book. It's a kind of a sort of YA romance. It's not quite. It sort of treads the line between YA and adult. But it's called Immortality, a Love Story.
Yes.
By Dana Schwartz. And it's a sequel to a book called Anatomy, a Love Story.
Okay.
So I'm going to try to tell you on both of these books. They're Gothic romances set in 19th century Scotland.
Okay.
And the first book is about these young surgeons who fall in love as they're robbing graves.
Oh, natural. Well, what could be a more romantic setting? How has that not been done before?
But it weirdly is. And the author, I really like the author. She's a young author. Her name is Dana Schwartz. She does a podcast that I'm obsessed with called Noble Blood. Have you ever listened to Noble Blood? Mm-mm. So she does this podcast where every episode she gets really into the history of a person of nobility in history or a royal. So, a king or a queen or a prince or a princess or an emperor, and really gets into the history. And you get so fascinated and you go down so many Wikipedia rabbit holes listening to every single one of those episodes. Like she'll do one about Marie Antoinette, for example, and you'll just learn really in depth all about Marie Antoinette. And it doesn't feel like you're at school. It doesn't feel like learning. She's just such a good storyteller. And these two books have the most, I can't show you on a podcast, but they have the most beautiful covers I've ever seen in my entire life. Like one looks like an anatomical image of a heart, but it's a woman with a red dress.
Ooh.
And another one looks like an anatomical depiction of a brain, but it's a woman in a pink dress. And so I don't know. They're lovely. They're escapist. They're not horror. I know there's grave robbing involved, but I swear it's more just Gothic.
Okay. Yeah. It's and that it seems that type of genre of book is where a lot of the action is on TikTok.
Yeah,
is that correct?
It really is. It really is.
Because when I go walk through, and occasionally I'll go into even, Barnes & Noble will do like a, as seen on TikTok, and one will be entirely Colleen Hoover because, of course. But then the other one will be lots of, vampire-y, sort of young love, sexy, spooky, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of, and it's stuff that also just sort of walks the line between YA and adult fiction, like not straight up YA, but stuff that, a teenager can and probably will read and really enjoy, and stuff that an adult can and will read and probably enjoy. Like definitely like Gothic romances and romantic thrillers, things that are romantic but with an edge.
Okay. I want to ask you real quick about, so when we last spoke, we talked about Spare.
Yes.
The Prince Harry memoir, and you gave us kind of the 411 about that. There's lots of detail, very revealing, and a very enjoyable memoir. There's another celebrity memoir coming out, and I think that you already wrote about it, from Pamela Anderson.
Oh, yes. It just came out. It came out last Tuesday. It's called Love, Pamela. There's also an accompanying Netflix documentary. Yes. So if you don't have time to read the book, there's a Netflix documentary that's very closely tied in called Pamela, a Love Story. It's interesting. The book is really interestingly constructed. So it's a lot of vignettes, and it's interspersed with poetry. Like she's written poetry, But, she was on Baywatch, the bombshell blonde on Baywatch, a Playboy cover girl. And she kind of, in this book, casts aside this glamorous facade to tell the true story, her true story. She's just a small town girl who got thrust into the limelight. And she just writes very openly about a lot of bad things that she experienced. She writes about her abuse. She had an abusive marriage with Tommy Lee. She experienced childhood sexual abuse. And she just writes about how posing for Playboy and sort of curating this image of herself was an act of empowerment for her because she was sort of able to take control of her image and her sexuality in a way. And so I just found it, she's one of those celebrities I don't think about very often and that I kind of take for granted. Like, oh, it's Pam Anderson. She's, the hot blonde lady on Baywatch and Home Improvement. And, I don't think of her much more deeply than that. But of course, she's a rich, nuanced, three-dimensional person like all of us. And so I like celebrity memoirs like that, where it's a person that I don't think of, it sounds bad, but there are celebrities that you don't think about as being people because you don't think about them very often. And then when they write a memoir like this, you're like, that's part of the struggle of being you, specifically Pam Anderson, is that a lot of people think of you that way.
Yeah, you're a commodity, not really a human being.
Right.
And it's wonderful when people get the opportunity and really take advantage of the opportunity to tell their own story, and not just kind of a sugar-coated, glossy version of it.
Yeah, and
really,
it definitely reads like she wrote it. Like, and I appreciate that. Like the Prince Harry memoir was ghostwritten, and I think it's well written. It was ghostwritten by a professional writer, and who's ghostwritten other memoirs, and it reads very well. And there's a roughness and a realness to Pam Anderson's memoir. Like, obviously, she's not a professional writer, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Another memoir that came out somewhat recently that reads kind of the same way is Viola Davis's memoir.
Oh, yes.
I think it was called Finding Me.
Yes.
And that came out last year. And I think it's clear that book was written by her as well. It sounds like she's having a conversation with you. And she's also a person who experienced a lot of trauma, deep, incredible poverty and dysfunction in her family, and is one of our best living actresses now. And I love celebrity memoirs where it's clear the celebrity has written them.
Yes. Yeah, and I thought that was incredible. And also if you like audiobooks, to hear Viola Davis tell her own story. I mean, her voice is so fantastic. She's obviously such an incredible actress. But I mean, just it's jarring because it's so emotional. Because just the racism and the just abuse and the cruelty, all of it. I mean, it was a very powerful, I thought.
It's one of those memoirs you're like, I have no excuse
for
anything. Like, experienced incredible racism and poverty and just so much that life threw at her at such an early age. And you read that and you're like, I am so privileged and I have no excuse.
Yeah, and the depth of the poverty. I mean, I really couldn't think of a story often that I had that described so much that you really feel
she writes about the rats
in
her home, and how there were always rats scurrying everywhere, and how she had to like strategize living with the rats. And it's like, wow,
and not being able to bathe and always smelling like urine and just, not having running water or hot water.
And there's a lot of embarrassment about writing about that. Like, a lot of, I don't feel like I read a ton of memoirs that really dig into poverty, because I think there's so much stigma and shame and embarrassment attached to that. And for her to be able to really get into the experience of poverty and what that was like for her, I think is unique.
Quite a few years ago, there was a memoir written by Jeanette Walls.
Oh, yeah.
Who wrote it's a Glass Castle, right? That was talking about her kind of very highly dysfunctional family, and her parents ended up being choosing to live on the streets, and she kind of created a very different life for herself.
Yeah.
But it was really an exploration of mental illness, but also what it's like to grow up impoverished in that way. She has another book coming out soon, early in this year, which is Hang the Moon, and I believe it's a novel, but I just remember her being I loved that memoir so much. So she's kind of that list for me of I'll read anything that she puts out.
Yeah, that is a good, Glass Castle is really good. I like the movie adaptation too. There was a movie adaptation a few years ago that was actually quite good.
Yes, yeah, that's a really moving book. So when do you find time to do all this reading?
When I like to read, it's hard. Life makes it hard to find time to read, which I think is a way that people fall into a rut of not reading, because you have to make time for it or it doesn't happen, right? So I always take a book with me wherever I go.
Yes.
That's number one. Because there's always downtime when you're out running life. You go to get your oil changed in your car and you have to sit there for like an hour. Bring a book with you. there's a traffic jam. I mean, literally I'll take it in the car with me when I'm going somewhere, because there could be a traffic jam. I could be stuck on the freeway for an hour or two. And so I always just have a book with me. I try to steal little moments in time throughout the day to read. And, if I'm sitting in the car waiting for somebody, I've got my book with me. And I try to do that instead of looking at my phone.
Yes.
I think, like everybody else, I have a problem with my smartphone. I'm always on Twitter. I'm always on TikTok, which I don't know why I'm always on TikTok, but I am. And so what I've been trying to do, instead of defaulting to Twitter and TikTok and my phone and social media, is defaulting to a book.
Yes.
I also read first thing in the morning. That's sort
Okay.
of my morning ritual. I wake up, I make my coffee, I sit down, I read for like half hour to an hour, whatever time I have in the morning. I make sure that I always read in the morning. My day does not feel correct if I don't read in the morning.
Nice. And lastly, what would be your advice? I feel it's a funny dynamic when you host a book club or are part of a book club, because people get kind of like a sense of like anxiety about, oh, it's like a deadline, or oh, it's like I'm in school again, or we do our neighborhood book club and I didn't have time, I was panicking, or people are reading all that afternoon in sort of a panic to finish up, and so it becomes like more of a chore. But then they say, well, at least I read the book because I needed that kind of deadline. So what advice do you give to people who like have trouble navigating that?
Well, I mean, I would say that book clubs are as much about community as they are about the
Yes.
books themselves, right? So we get people who show up at book club and they're like, well, I didn't finish the book, or I only read half of it, or I still haven't finished the ending yet, but I wanted to come and be with my friends and listen to what everybody has to say as I'm trying to process this book. And it's fine. I mean, I would don't stress out about it.
Yeah.
It's so much about the community of the book club, and it doesn't matter if you didn't finish the book. It doesn't matter if you hated the book. It doesn't matter if you don't have any deep thoughts about the book. And sometimes just the act of being at the book club and listening to what other people have to say will give you something to carry away about the book. Like
Yes.
I hear from people all the time who show up at book club and they're like, I didn't really understand or like this book when I came in. And now that I'm leaving and I've heard the conversation, I have this sort of richer understanding of it. And it makes me want to like finish it or try it again, or at least I can appreciate what it was doing now. So, I mean, the book is a vehicle for you to build community. I mean, it's also about the book, right? You do want to have conversations about it and understand it and be a better, smarter, more informed reader. But it's so much about the friends you make and the community you build.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to get to know you and to be reading about your recommendations. And so we know you're on the social, so we find you USA Today, contributing regularly and overseeing many of the articles that are book and entertainment related, right?
Yep. You find me at USA Today. You can find me in person at Changing Hands Bookstore at 7 p.m., usually the fourth Wednesday of every month.
Okay.
And you can find me on Twitter at BabsVan. And
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
She's at Changing Hands. I mean,
I'm always
she's going to be there.
I'm going to go there after this.
You're going to find her there. Just yell out, Barbara. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Olivia's Book Club, the podcast. I'm your host, Olivia Fierro. Our producer is Margaret Stewart. You can send us an email with your thoughts or your book recommendations. Olivia's Book Club at azfamily.com is the address. And you can check out Olivia's Book Club on Facebook or find us on Instagram. Hello, Bookstagrammers, at olivias.bookclub. And Margaret is at Overbooked and Overdue. Make sure to rate and subscribe to this podcast and tell your friends. You can find us on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and Amazon Music.
This is Olivia's Book Club, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.